First Edition. Warhammer 40K has been around for nearly 40 years, and it has never been the same game twice. Every edition reshuffled the rules, expanded the lore, killed off some ideas, and introduced ones that would later become untouchable. If you picked up Rogue Trader in 1987, you'd barely recognize the universe you were holding, because this was even before 40K was 40K. The rulebook was written almost entirely by Rick Priestley and released at Games Day on the 9th of October 1987. It was technically a war game, but it played more like a role-playing game. Battles were small, characters had pages of equipment options, and the rulebook actually assumed the presence of a game master, similar to a dungeon master in Dungeons & Dragons. The Imperium existed, Space Marines existed, the Emperor was already sitting on the Golden Throne, but chaos as we know it wasn't even part of the rulebook yet. The Horus Heresy was a vague historical footnote rather than a fully developed mythology. Squats were a playable faction. A character was named Inquisitor Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau. The tone was closer to British sci-fi satire than grimdark epic. Most fans learned about it through the rulebook itself, through the earliest miniature releases, and Games Workshop's monthly hobby magazine called The White Dwarf. The community was small and scattered, built around hobby shops and word of mouth. Rogue Trader was experimental in ways that will never be repeated. Some ideas like the Sensei, the Illuminati, and alien races such as the Slan would slowly fade from the setting and become little more than trivia for lore veterans. Others became the foundations of the entire franchise. The Imperium, the Emperor on the Golden Throne, Space Marines, Orcs, Eldar, Psykers, Warp Travel, and Rogue Traders all made their debut here. Second Edition. Released in 1993, games moved from small skirmish groups to full armies in the second edition. Codices became the primary way players learned the lore of individual factions, each one packed with art, history, and character profiles that gave the setting actual texture. For the first time, the Imperium felt less like a loose collection of science fiction concepts and more like an actual decaying civilization held together by fanaticism and bureaucracy. The lore expanded in every direction. The Tyranids evolved from mysterious alien predators into a galaxy-devouring threat, with hive fleets receiving their own names and backstories for the first time. Chaos Space Marine legions gained identities beyond simply being traders, with factions like the World Eaters, Death Guard, and Thousand Sons developing their own cultures, histories, and grudges. Space Marine chapters became distinct rather than just different paint schemes. The Horus Heresy also began taking shape, still little more than scattered fragments of history, but the foundations of the Imperium's greatest civil war were being laid. For many veteran hobbyists, this was the first time 40K felt like a living universe. The art got richer, the battles got bigger, the writing got darker. Some older fans still consider second edition to be the aesthetic peak of the game, dense, strange, and packed with personality. By the end of second edition, Games Workshop had figured out what Warhammer 40K actually was. The weird experiment from Rogue Trader had become a universe. The third edition. In the third edition, Games Workshop took a bold step by simplifying the rules, making the game way more accessible. Armies grew bigger and playtime shrank. New players could actually pick up the game in just one afternoon instead of spending 3 weeks trying to figure it out. Here, the Dark Eldar burst onto the scene as the twisted counterpart to the Craftworld Eldar. Meanwhile, the Necrons emerged as the ultimate cosmic nightmare of machines serving godlike entities known as the Catan. The Cadian Gate became a pivotal location in the lore, with Abaddon's Black Crusades posing a serious threat to the Imperium's main defense against the Eye of Terror. For a significant chunk of the modern fanbase, this was their first taste of Warhammer 40K. Starter boxes made it easy to dive in, and early internet communities helped spread the lore far and wide. One of the biggest retcons of the third edition never even made it into the rulebooks. The Squats, a fully playable faction with their own models and rules since the first edition, simply vanished from third edition. There was no in-universe explanation, no epic final showdown. They were just gone. The Squats became the prime example of a faction that had been wiped from existence, leading the community to coin the term "getting squatted" to describe any army or character that GW quietly decided to remove. That phrase is still in use today. Fourth edition. After the sweeping overhaul of the third edition, Games Workshop chose refinement over reinvention. The core systems introduced in third edition were polished into a cleaner, more consistent rule set that simply worked better. Many of the awkward edge cases disappeared, creating a faster and more balanced game. For many veteran players, fourth edition remains one of the finest examples of the classic Warhammer 40K rules system. While the tabletop stabilized, the setting continued to grow richer. Chapter histories expanded, imperial institutions received greater depth, and campaign books increasingly connected multiple factions into a more cohesive galaxy. Warhammer was becoming more than a collection of isolated armies. It was evolving into a living universe. The edition's biggest legacy came through Black Library. In 2006, Dan Abnett's Horus Rising launched the Horus Heresy novel series, transforming what had long been a legendary backstory into a fully realized epic. The Primarchs ceased to be distant mythological figures and became fully developed characters, while events that had once been summarized in a few paragraphs began unfolding across dozens of novels. Fifth edition. This was arguably the most beloved edition in Warhammer 40K history. It was also the one that made the setting's biggest weakness impossible to ignore. The game hit a sweet spot that fans still argue has never been fully recaptured. Mechanized warfare, iconic army builds, clean rules that actually rewarded tactical thinking. Grey Knights and Blood Angels received major expansions that gave both factions genuinely distinctive playstyles and rich lore identities. The Horus Heresy series grew from a modest experiment into one of the most ambitious ongoing projects in tabletop gaming. Stories that had been half-remembered background detail for 20 years, the siege of Terra, the relationships between Primarchs, the Emperor's actual personality, became fully realized narratives read by millions. The problem was the timeline. 6th edition. This edition began laying the groundwork for the future of Warhammer 40K. On the tabletop, new mechanics such as flyers, fortifications, and an ally system made battles feel larger and more cinematic, even if the added complexity sometimes created as many problems as it solved. The edition's biggest impact, however, came through the Necrons. A dramatic rewrite that began with their 5th edition codex became the new status quo during 6th. The silent killing machines introduced in 3rd edition evolved into ancient dynasties ruled by ambitious overlords with distinct personalities and rivalries. The Catan, once portrayed as omnipotent star gods commanding the Necrons, were revealed to have been shattered into enslaved fragments after a rebellion by their own servants. Characters such as Trastan the Infinite, Imhotep the Stormlord, and the Silent King transformed the Necrons from an unknowable force of nature into one of the setting's richest civilizations. The Necron overhaul became one of the most important retcons in Warhammer 40K history. Fans quickly split into camps that jokingly became known as Old Crons and New Crons. Some preferred the cosmic horror of the original Necrons, while others embraced the dynastic politics and larger cast of memorable characters. Narrative supplements also became increasingly important, while digital releases allowed Games Workshop to expand the setting more rapidly than traditional codices alone. Rather than waiting years for major rulebooks, new campaigns and storylines could now appear throughout an edition. 7th edition. For most of 7th edition, the galaxy remained trapped in its familiar frozen state. Supplements multiplied and the competitive scene grew increasingly complicated. Fans joked that playing 7th edition required a law degree and a spreadsheet. Then Gathering Storm arrived and everything changed. Cadia finally fell. The fortress world that had stood sentinel before the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years was destroyed by Abaddon the Despoiler in the climactic event the setting had been building towards since the late 1980s. The Inari emerged as the Eldari's bold new answer to chaos. Archmagos Belisarius Cawl stepped onto the galactic stage with secrets 10 millennia in the making, and Roboute Guilliman was finally restored to life and named Imperial Regent. For the first time in decades, the Warhammer 40K timeline moved forward. Online communities, lore channels, podcasts, and forums exploded with rants and raves. The fall of Cadia also transformed how fans viewed Abaddon himself. For years, his 12 previous Black Crusades had earned him the mocking nickname Failbottom, with many dismissing them as a string of unsuccessful invasions. Whether viewed as a brilliant long-term reveal or a retroactive rewrite, it fundamentally changed one of Warhammer 40K's oldest stories. 8th edition. The destruction of the Cadian pylons, ancient structures that had helped contain the warp around the Eye of Terror, triggered the greatest upheaval in the setting since the Horus Heresy. The Great Rift tore the galaxy in two, isolating entire sectors from Terra as demonic invasions erupted across thousands of worlds. The Imperium, already stretched to its limits, was now fighting for survival on both sides of a galaxy-spanning warp storm. On the tabletop, Games Workshop completely rebooted the rules. 8th edition was the biggest mechanical overhaul since Rogue Trader, sweeping away years of accumulated complexity in favor of a faster, more accessible game. The Dark Imperium launch box, pitting the newly introduced Primaris Space Marines against the Death Guard, became a massive success and helped usher in a new generation of players. The Primaris Marines quickly became the edition's defining edition, presented as a new breed of Space Marines secretly developed by Belisarius Cawl over 10,000 years at Guilliman's command. They were larger, stronger, and equipped with improved gene seed and entirely new war gear. They also became one of the most controversial lore changes in modern Warhammer. For decades, Firstborn Space Marines had represented the peak of the Emperor's genetic engineering, making the revelation of an even more advanced breed feel like a major rewrite of established history. Some fans embraced the new models immediately, while others questioned how such an enormous project could have remained hidden for millennia. Beyond the tabletop, Warhammer entered a new era of popularity. Black Library continued to expand, lore channels and battle report creators reached audiences far beyond the traditional hobby, and thousands of new fans discovered the setting through the combination of striking new miniatures and a storyline that had finally broken decades of narrative stagnation. 9th edition. Launched during the COVID-19 pandemic, Warhammer's timing proved remarkable. As millions of people spent more time at home, hobby communities grew rapidly, painting tutorials and battle reports reached more audiences, and a new wave of fans discovered Warhammer 40K through online creators. the 9th edition's narrative focus shifted toward one of the setting's oldest civilizations. Zarek, the Silent King and last ruler of the Necrontyr, returned to the galaxy after a self-imposed exile that had lasted some 60 million years. His reappearance transformed the Necrons from a collection of awakening tomb worlds into a civilization pursuing a coordinated, galaxy-spanning agenda. The Pariah Nexus became the centerpiece of this new conflict, as Necron ambitions threatened entire Imperial sectors and drew multiple factions into a struggle. On the tabletop, 9th edition refined the foundations laid by 8th, placing greater emphasis on missions, objective play, and battlefield control. Rather than reinventing the game, it focused on making the existing system more polished and strategically rewarding. The Silent King's return also redefined Necron history. Once portrayed as a ruler who had abandoned his people after condemning them to biotransference, Zarek was recast as a monarch carrying out a penance measured across geological time before returning to confront the galaxy's greatest threats. 10th edition. For years, the Tyranids loomed as the terrifying menace lurking at the edge of the galaxy, an unstoppable swarm that everyone knew was on its way, yet rarely took the spotlight for long. But 10th edition changed all that. The Fourth Tyrannic War thrust Hive Fleet Leviathan to the center of the latest galactic crisis. Massive tendrils of the Hive Fleet crashed into Segmentum Pacificus, overwhelming Imperial defenses and plunging entire sectors into desperate battles for survival. New Tyranid organisms emerged in staggering numbers, hinting that the Hive mind was evolving at an unprecedented pace. However, the Tyranids were just one threat in a galaxy already buckling under the strain of multiple disasters. The Great Rift continued to cleave the Imperium in two. The fallout from Abaddon's Arcs of Omen campaign continued to reshape the strategic landscape. Angron rampaged across Imperial space following his return, while Vashtor pursued his own enigmatic goals. The Necrons continued awakening on countless tomb worlds, and Orcs, Gene Stealer cults, and Chaos warbands exploited the growing instability. Even with Robute Guilliman leading the Imperium's efforts to stabilize the realm, humanity faced more threats than at any point in recent history. On the tabletop, 10th edition continued the accessibility push that began with 8th edition. Army rules were streamlined, faction mechanics simplified, and datasheets redesigned to make the game easier to learn while preserving each faction's unique identity. The Leviathan launch box became a massive commercial success, pairing an extensively refreshed Tyranid range with a campaign that gave the Fourth Tyrannic War far greater narrative weight than previous Tyranid invasions. Its success also reflected Warhammer 40K's growing mainstream reach. By the mid-2020s, major tournaments were attracting larger audiences than ever before, while online creators introduced millions of new fans to the setting. The era culminated in Games Workshop's partnership with Amazon to develop Warhammer film and television projects, with longtime fan Henry Cavill attached as an executive producer and star. For many fans, it was the clearest sign yet that Warhammer had grown from a cult tabletop hobby into a global entertainment franchise. 11th edition. 11th edition arrived in June 2026 and did something few expected after years of galaxy-shaking storylines. It returned to one of Warhammer 40K's most iconic battlefields. The launch box, Armageddon, shifts the focus back to the legendary Hive world as war erupts once again. Picking up directly after the Return of Yarrick campaign, the Orc vanguard led by Speed Freak warboss Wazdaka Gutsmech has already made planetfall. While Gaj-Kol Thraka's main invasion force closes in, Commissar Yarrick sends a desperate call for aid across the stars, answered by the Blood Angels, who lead a coalition of Space Marine chapters, including the Salamanders, Ultramarines, and Space Wolves in Operation Imperator. On the tabletop, Games Workshop chose evolution over revolution. Rather than reinventing the game as 8th edition had done, 11th refined the foundations laid by 10th. Existing codexes remained fully compatible at launch, allowing every faction to continue playing without waiting for replacement books. The detachment system became modular, letting players combine multiple detachments within a single army and greatly expanding list-building options. Objective markers also shifted from fixed circles to terrain features, encouraging battles that flowed more naturally across the battlefield. The Armageddon launch box, containing 61 push-fit miniatures, was described by Games Workshop as the largest starter set in Warhammer 40,000 history, underscoring the scale of the edition's debut. Yet the biggest surprise was the setting. After years of escalating galaxy-wide wars involving the Great Rift, the Fourth Tyrannic War, and the Arcs of Omen, Games Workshop chose to begin its newest edition by returning to one of the most nostalgic conflicts in Warhammer history. On the recent launch of the 11th edition, Armageddon burns once again. Thanks for watching until the end. Click here to check out another video and see you in the next one.